Sometimes history whispers a story that shouldn't exist, and the stranger part? It's a story people insist is still unfolding right now, behind closed doors, in quiet boardrooms, in palaces with very old foundations, and maybe tucked somewhere in the family tree of someone whose name you definitely know. Tonight we're sinking gently into one of those stories, the kind that slips between myth and anthropology, between faith and uncomfortable speculation. A story people have been arguing about for thousands of years, the mystery of the Nephilim, and the idea that echoing somewhere in the veins of the world's elite is a secret bloodline older than civilization itself. That idea alone is enough to make anyone sit up a little straighter, but here's the gentle twist, the part most people miss. The real story isn't about monsters, conspiracies, or dramatic revelations. It's about how ancient people understood power, difference, and ancestry in a world where every shadow seemed connected to the heavens. However, this mystery also manages to brush against modern imagination with an ease that's almost suspicious. We're drawn to the idea that elites aren't just wealthy or well-connected, but fundamentally different, built from older, stranger roots that stretch beneath the foundations of civilization. Yet the truth, as always, is quieter, more human, and somehow more fascinating. Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. If you're settling in tonight, take a second to dim the screen, take a breath, and let the edges of your day soften a little. And before we drift too far into the ancient world, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing that quiet constellation of viewers across the world, all drifting into the same story. And if you enjoy falling asleep to deep dives into history's strangest mysteries, subscribe to continue exploring the hidden corners of the past crafted for restful sleep. Tonight, we're beginning with the earliest world that produced the Nephilim myth. Not the elite families, not the conspiracies, not the speculation, but the daily life that shaped the legend. A world where the sky was close, the nights were long, and human imagination did just as much heavy lifting as survival itself. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander slowly back in time. Chapter 1. The world before the myth became myth. Imagine yourself in the ancient Near East, long before writing carved itself into stone and long before cities began stacking generation upon generation like geological layers of ambition. Life moved slowly here, shaped by earth, sky, and the quiet uncertainty that came with each passing season. People woke with the sun, worked with the sun, rested with the stars, and tried not to think too hard about the constant unpredictability of nature. You can almost hear it now, the steady rhythm of grinding grain, the murmur of animals shifting in their pens, the distant voices of early morning markets forming like a soft chorus across the desert air. This was a world where every day required effort, patience, and a kind of stubborn resilience that few modern people ever have to summon. In a landscape like this, anything extraordinary became meaningful. If someone stood taller, walked with unusual strength, or possessed a voice that carried authority without trying, people noticed. The ordinary rhythm of life made difference stand out sharply, and ancient communities, lacking the vocabulary of genetics or physiology, reached naturally for stories to explain those differences. Not elaborate myths at first, more like murmurs, soft suggestions that some people carried traits from elsewhere, from realms beyond the human one. When the world feels enchanted, explanations become enchanted too. But to truly understand why the idea of beings like the Nephilim emerged, you need to picture not just the environment, but the mindset. This was a world without hard boundaries between the natural and supernatural. The sky wasn't distant, it was inhabited. Mountains weren't just mountains, they were dwellings of spirits. Storms weren't random, they were expressions of divine personalities. A person living in this world moved through layers of meaning with every step. So when someone exceptional appeared, someone who didn't quite fit the mold, the explanation didn't begin with biology. It began with cosmology. In a village of modest height, a man who reached 6 feet might as well have been a living legend. In a place where survival depended on consistency, someone whose strength seemed inexhaustible felt almost mythic. And because humans have always loved stories more than explanations, these people became the seeds of narratives, tales of ancient unions between heavenly beings and humans, echoes of forgotten eras, or remnants of a time when the world felt more fluid and less defined. But the earliest versions of these stories weren't dramatic. They weren't painted with the huge brushstrokes of later mythology. They were simple, whispered ideas shaped by the emotions of people facing a vast and unpredictable world. Imagine a grandmother sitting beside a fire, telling children about mighty ones from the old days, not to frighten them, but to make sense of the unknown. Imagine farmers pointing at ruins on a hill and saying they were made by ancient beings, taller and stronger than anyone alive. Imagine warriors believing that the fiercest combatants carried a spark from an older lineage. The myth didn't arrive fully formed. It accumulated slowly, one observation at a time. And here's the quiet, often overlooked truth. These early myths were not about danger, they were about understanding. They translated difference into story. They gave shape to awe. They gave meaning to the extraordinary. Before the Nephilim became symbols of fear or fascination, they were simply attempts to answer old, persistent human questions. Why are some people so much stronger? Why does one leader command loyalty that others struggle to earn? Why do certain individuals seem born for prominence? The myth lived in these questions long before it became text. Of course, daily life continued around these stories. People tended flocks, traded goods, navigated disputes, celebrated harvests, and endured hardships. The world was not dominated by myth. Myth was woven gently into it, a quiet framework supporting an otherwise demanding life. And in that framework, the idea of ancient beings who once walked the earth didn't feel unbelievable. It felt necessary. It made the world feel full, textured, and connected. An interesting detail is that many of the earliest communities believed their ancestors had direct contact with beings from the sky. Not physical contact necessarily, but symbolic, ritualistic, or dreamlike encounters. Dreams held enormous significance. Visions were treated as messages. Mystical intuition was seen as evidence of otherworldly influence. People lived in a universe where meaning didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be felt. So when someone said, "Long ago, there were mighty ones who lived differently than we do," the entire community understood both the literal and symbolic reading. And slowly, as generations passed, these ideas crystallized. The beings became more defined, the stories became more structured, the mighty ones became hybrid figures, born of watchers and humans, carrying traits that seemed beyond the ordinary. And although we often imagine the Nephilim as towering giants, the earliest listeners would have pictured something subtler, people who simply didn't fit the quiet rhythm of daily life. People who stood out, people whose presence invited a story. What makes this early phase so important is that it reveals the foundation beneath everything that comes later. The genealogies, the royal lineages, the elite claims of otherworldly descent. Before any of that complexity arrived, the myth grew among ordinary people living ordinary lives. It wasn't shaped by elites at first. It shaped itself in the imaginations of farmers, shepherds, traders, and elders trying to understand why the world felt both familiar and mysterious at the same time. And as the myth grew, it carried with it the emotional weight of daily life, the longing for meaning, the reverence for difference, the desire for explanation. The earliest Nephilim stories were not warnings or accusations. They were reflections of how humans experience wonder. And that wonder is where the story truly begins. To understand why the Nephilim myth took root so deeply in ancient cultures, we need to look closely at the social fabric of the era, not just the environment or the beliefs, but the emotional and psychological landscape that shaped how people interpreted difference. In a world where daily life required constant physical labor, where danger was never more than a season away, and where survival depended on cooperation and tradition, any deviation from the norm stood out sharply. People noticed everything: who walked taller, who spoke with authority, who seemed to predict storms, who healed sickness, who calmed disputes, who commanded respect without raising a hand. These qualities mattered, they carried weight, and ancient people, lacking the scientific frameworks we take for granted today, reached for explanations that blended observation with myth. Imagine watching someone in your village who towers ahead above everyone else. You don't think about nutrition or genetics. You think about ancestry. You think about old stories of beings who once walked the earth. You think about spirits, watchers, or gods who crossed into the human realm. Or picture a young leader who, without any training or lineage, draws people together with effortless charisma. In a world that values stability and predictability, this sudden rise feels uncanny. Explanations naturally drift toward the supernatural. The extraordinary demands extraordinary origins, and this instinct to interpret difference through cosmic narrative wasn't unique to a single region. It appeared everywhere humans settled. In early Mesopotamia, kings were described as chosen by the gods, their strength and insight derived from divine favor. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was literally considered the son of a god, his bloodline carrying a spark of something not entirely human. In the Levant, people spoke quietly of mighty men of old, figures whose deeds seemed impossible for ordinary mortals. These weren't exaggerations meant to entertain. They were attempts to understand why some people seemed destined to stand above others. The Nephilim myth emerged directly from this emotional landscape. It wasn't created for fear or fascination, but for explanation. Ancient people didn't believe the world was chaotic. They believed the world was connected, everything caused by something, everything woven into a larger story. So when they encountered someone whose abilities seemed beyond the norm, they fit that person into the only framework they had, the cosmic one. The Watchers descended, they said, the realms mixed, and from these unions came people whose presence echoed the ancient world, not literal giants towering over villages, but individuals who carried a hint of the extraordinary. This mindset also shaped how people interpreted conflict. When one tribe defeated another with surprising ease, the victors weren't simply stronger, they were seen as cosmically favored. Their warriors weren't just better trained, they were believed to carry ancient lineage. This transformed battles into mythic events. Leaders became heroes of renown. Victories became signs, defeats became warnings. The Nephilim, or beings like them, became the symbolic ancestors of might, courage, dominance, and sometimes destruction. What makes this especially meaningful is that the myth didn't live in isolation. It interacted with daily life in subtle ways. A farmer might tell his children that a neighboring clan was descended from ancient heroes to explain their reputation as fierce warriors. A merchant might avoid certain regions because the people there were rumored to have giant blood, not in a literal sense, but in a way that signaled they were shaped by an older, more formidable lineage. Myth blended into social perception, and perception shaped behavior. And once a story shapes behavior, it begins to perpetuate itself. But the myth also served a gentler purpose. It offered reassurance. In a world full of hardship, where floods could erase a year's work and illness could sweep through entire communities, people sought meaning in everything. If some individuals seemed destined for greatness, it meant the world wasn't random. It meant there was order, even if that order was mysterious. The extraordinary became a sign that the universe had patterns. And when your life depended on the cooperation of land, weather, animals, and community, believing in cosmic patterns felt comforting. This belief spilled into storytelling traditions as well. Oral stories passed down through generations described ancient beings whose lives were grander and more dramatic than anything in the present. They weren't horror stories. They were reflections of longing for a time when the world felt more enchanted, when the boundaries between heaven and earth were less rigid, when greatness walked openly. The Nephilim became symbols of that imagined age, a time when the extraordinary was normal. As these stories traveled, they changed color depending on the listener. Some communities remembered the ancient hybrids as heroes. Others remembered them as warnings. Others remembered them as symbols of imbalance, beings whose existence pushed the world toward chaos. But regardless of interpretation, the core idea remained the same. The world once held people who carried something beyond the human norm. It's interesting to think about how this shaped interpersonal relationships. A child born unusually tall or strong might be treated with quiet reverence. A leader who solved disputes with uncanny insight might be seen as carrying echoes of ancient lineage. These weren't superstitions in the way we think of the word today. They were practical frameworks for understanding difference, and because they blended seamlessly into daily life, they felt realistic. What also made the myth powerful was its flexibility. It could be taken literally, symbolically, spiritually, or socially. It didn't demand strict interpretation. It simply offered a lens, a way to see people who stood apart. And because human societies always produce outliers, the myth always had new figures to attach itself to. Even now, modern people sometimes look at the extraordinary, world leaders, innovators, celebrities, dynasties, and wonder whether there's something different in their blood. The language has changed, the context has shifted, but the impulse remains the same. We still reach for stories to explain what feels unexplainable. But in the ancient world, these stories weren't whispers of conspiracy. They were part of the rhythm of life. They offered structure to a world that needed stories to define itself. As this segment closes, imagine the ancient people who first shaped these myths, sitting around small fires at dusk, watching the sun melt into the horizon, telling children about mighty ones of old, not because they wanted to frighten them, but because stories help people make sense of their place in the world. The Nephilim were not monsters, they were explanations, and those explanations would become the foundation for everything that followed: the royal genealogies, the political lineages, and eventually the theory of elite bloodlines that continues to intrigue people thousands of years later. As human communities grew more settled and socially complex, something subtle began to happen to the old stories. What started as casual explanations, the kinds of things people murmured while working fields or discussing local leaders, began slow shifting into something more structured, more permanent, and more politically useful. Stories that once floated freely through the air, carried by memory and shaped by the needs of the moment, gradually hardened into origin myths, and origin myths, in turn, began shaping lineage. Picture a small settlement on the edge of a fertile plain. Most people live modest lives defined by weather, the rhythms of tending crops, and the occasional visit from traveling merchants. But in the center of the settlement sits a family whose presence feels slightly different. Perhaps they own more land. Perhaps they're taller or more physically imposing. Perhaps they simply have a long-standing reputation for leadership. People want explanations for these differences, and the explanations they choose reflect the stories they already believe. Someone says their ancestors were like the mighty ones from the early days, and no one questions it. Someone else claims the family carries a spark from ancient beings who wandered the earth long before the present world took shape, and the story sticks. There is no need for proof. The story feels true. This is how myths slowly root themselves into identity, not aggressively, not ceremonially, but gently, shaped by everyday observation and shared understanding. Over time, the idea that certain families came from different origins became something like a quiet social assumption. Not everyone believed it literally, but everyone acknowledged it as a meaningful story. And meaning, in ancient societies, carried as much weight as fact. The earliest forms of lineage were not written documents. They were spoken lists of names passed through generations, remembered by elders who understood that identity was constructed as much through memory as through blood. When these elders recited lineage, they didn't distinguish between historical ancestors and mythic ones. A figure of renown from an old story could sit comfortably alongside a known grandfather or great-grandfather. The boundary between the real and the legendary was not a wall. It was a gentle fade, like one color blending into another. This blending was not deception. It was worldview. People genuinely believed the earliest ancestors of humanity were closer to the divine realm, closer to beings who shaped the world. As time moved forward, humanity became more ordinary, more removed from cosmic influence. So it made perfect sense that the most ancient ancestors, the ones farthest back in memory, would be the ones tied most closely to myth. And if a particular family seemed unusual, impressive, or important, it was natural to place their origins nearer to that ancient, enchanted time. Stories of the Nephilim, or beings like them, settled naturally into this structure. They were not monstrous in early imagination. They were extraordinary. A clan might claim descent from the mighty ones, not to frighten people, but to explain their position in society. Strength, height, wisdom, or charisma became signs of ancient heritage, and just as importantly, communities found comfort in these stories. They made the social hierarchy feel justified. If a leader descended from ancient beings, then leadership seemed less arbitrary. Power had roots, authority had narrative. This belief was reinforced by the landscape itself. Ancient ruins, large stone structures, or unusual geological formations were often attributed to beings of great size or strength. People assumed that their ancestors, or predecessors in the land, were larger, physically, culturally, or spiritually. The past always felt grander than the present. The Nephilim myth matched that emotional truth. It reflected a sense that humanity had diminished from some earlier, loftier form. And because people believed the past held greater beings, they were willing to imagine that traces of those beings lingered in certain lineages. We often underestimate how much ancient people relied on storytelling to maintain social cohesion. Stories defined group identity, moral expectations, and political structure. They explained who belonged, who led, and why. A lineage that traced back to ancient hybrids was not a curiosity, it was a stabilizing force. It turned authority into continuity, and continuity, especially in a world full of uncertainty, felt like a blessing. The other interesting aspect of this early stage is how flexible myth remained. A family didn't need to prove literal descent from giant beings. They only needed a narrative that felt ancient and meaningful. The story didn't need to be dramatic. It could be as simple as our ancestors were among the first, or our forefathers lived in the age of the mighty. Over generations, these simple claims gained weight. People repeated them, children learned them, and eventually they took on the shape of truth, not because they were factually verifiable, but because they were emotionally resonant. This is how the Nephilim myth gradually transformed from a story about exceptional individuals to a story about ancestral distinction. But something else contributed to this shift: the human need to categorize difference. Even without formal class structures, societies always noticed patterns. Certain families seemed wealthier, certain leaders seemed more competent, certain warriors seemed unmatched. Instead of attributing these differences to random chance or personal ability, people wove them into lineage, and once lineage became the explanation, the myth deepened. If a powerful family fell on hard times, people assumed their ancient lineage had weakened. If they rose suddenly, people assumed their old blood had awakened. Myth and social perception fed each other endlessly. This feedback loop also shaped how communities interpreted conflict. When groups clashed, victory could be attributed to superior lineage. Defeat could be traced to ancient failures or forgotten cosmic rules. The myth offered a lens through which every event, large or small, could be interpreted. The world became a tapestry where nothing happened without a reason, without roots in a story that began long before anyone living could remember. And in this quiet but powerful way, the Nephilim myth continued expanding, not as a dramatic saga, but as a gentle shaping of identity. It filled the gaps left by a lack of scientific knowledge. It offered explanations when logic felt insufficient, and it provided a sense of belonging in a world where belonging was essential for survival. By the time writing began capturing these stories, they were already deeply woven into cultural memory. The Nephilim were no longer marginal figures, they were foundational ones. They marked the point where human ancestry touched something ancient, something transcendent, and because of this, they became the bedrock upon which elite genealogies would later be built. In this final section of Chapter 1, what we begin to recognize is that the myth didn't arise because ancient people wanted sensational stories. It arose because they wanted meaning, they wanted continuity, they wanted explanations for the extraordinary, and those explanations became identities that shaped everything from leadership to social structure. As we prepare to close the chapter, imagine those early communities again, the soft glow of firelight, the hum of evening insects, the quiet retelling of ancestral stories. In those spaces, myth wasn't entertainment, it was understanding. And the Nephilim were not creatures of fear. They were reminders of how humans reach for the extraordinary whenever the ordinary feels too small. As ancient societies grew, expanded, and developed more defined social layers, something subtle yet pivotal occurred. Myth began to solidify into identity. The stories that once lived loosely in the air, swirling around campfires and drifting between villages, gradually hardened into something people claimed, inherited, and protected. The myth of the Nephilim, once a flexible explanation for exceptional individuals, became a statement of origin, a way for communities and families to say, this is who we are, and this is where we come from. And once myth becomes identity, it becomes powerful in ways people rarely anticipate. Picture a gathering of elders in a small settlement. They sit beneath the open sky, recounting the names of ancestors stretching back through generations. Some names are known, some are half forgotten, and some belong to that hazy era before the flood, before the wars, or before the land was divided. These early segments of lineage were never meant to be literal history. They were symbolic markers representing a time when the world felt more mysterious, more alive, and more open to the influence of heavenly beings. So when elders spoke of ancestors mighty in the old days, or born in the age of watchers, they weren't claiming monstrous lineage. They were linking themselves to a mythic past that provided context for their place in the world. This is the moment when the Nephilim myth stopped being simply a story and became a genealogy. Once people placed these beings into their family lines, the myth transformed. It gained structure, it gained permanence, and families began shaping their identities around it. What's remarkable is how naturally this shift occurred. No scribe or ruler forced it. It emerged organically, as ordinary people tried to make sense of ancestry in a world where memory extended only a few generations before dissolving into legend. Without written records, the distant past became a canvas onto which communities painted whatever meaning they needed, and the meaning they chose, more often than not, involved beings who once blurred the line between the human and the divine. As societies became more interconnected, these stories traveled. A clan that believed its ancestors descended from mighty ones might encounter another clan with a similar belief. Sometimes these stories merged, reinforcing each other. Other times they created competition. Whose ancestors were closer to the divine? Whose lineage held greater renown? Myth became a quiet social currency. Not something traded openly, but something that influenced alliances, marriages, and respect. You can imagine how this played out in everyday life. A marriage negotiation might include references to ancient lineage, casually mentioned as though it were common knowledge. A dispute between clans might invoke ancestral stories to justify claims to land or leadership. These references weren't made to intimidate. They were made to frame events within a larger story. People lived inside myth. Myth lived inside people. And this blending of myth and identity shaped how communities viewed physical and social differences. If someone in a family line was consistently taller or stronger, that trait reinforced the myth of extraordinary ancestry. If a lineage produced leaders generation after generation, it strengthened the sense that the family carried something ancient. Myth validated reality, reality validated myth, and the cycle continued, tightening with each generation. This cycle also created what we might call mythic expectation. Families who claimed ancient lineage were expected to behave differently, to lead, to protect, to embody certain qualities associated with their mythic ancestors. If a member of such a lineage fell short, people wondered whether the old blood had thinned. If someone exceeded expectations, people whispered that the old blood had awakened. Myth didn't just shape the past, it shaped the future. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Nephilim myth, like many ancient myths, carried an emotional truth that people clung to. It spoke to the feeling that humanity was once closer to the divine, closer to mystery, closer to a time when the extraordinary was possible. Even if people didn't picture literal giants walking the earth, they believed the world had shifted, that something ancient had receded. Claiming descent from that ancient era wasn't about claiming supernatural power. It was about holding on to a connection with that lost world. As writing began to spread, these myths found new life in recorded genealogies. Scribes captured lineages that blended memory with legend, anchoring families to mythic origins that had previously existed only in spoken tradition. Once written, these genealogies took on new authority. They could be referenced, preserved, and passed down unchanged. And this is when myth truly became identity. What had once been flexible became fixed. What had once been symbolic became structural. It's important to understand that ancient people didn't see this as fabrication. They saw it as honoring the truth. Not the factual truth, perhaps, but the emotional and cultural truth that shaped their understanding of existence. In their worldview, the earliest humans lived in an enchanted world, close to divine beings. So it made perfect sense that the earliest ancestors of prominent families would come from that enchanted era. This belief wasn't a sign of ignorance, it was a sign of coherence. It made their world feel unified. This coherence influenced how communities perceived leadership. A leader who claimed ancestry from ancient beings didn't just have social power, he had mythic resonance. His authority wasn't merely political, it was cosmic. He wasn't simply chosen by people, he was chosen by lineage. And because ancient societies valued continuity and tradition, lineage mattered just as much as capability. A leader's decisions carried the weight of centuries. His actions weren't seen as isolated events, but as continuations of an ancestral story stretching back to the age when watchers descended from the sky. Even at this early stage, before kings formalized their genealogies and before aristocratic families solidified their claims, the template was laid. The myth of the Nephilim provided a conceptual framework for elite identity long before elites consciously adopted it. Ordinary people created the foundation. Elites would later build upon it. This early phase is crucial because it reveals something important. The Nephilim myth didn't begin as a theory about global elites or hidden rulers. It began as a way for ordinary people to understand heritage, difference, and the sense that the distant past was somehow larger, stranger, and more meaningful than the present. It was a worldview that said, we come from somewhere significant, and that belief shaped how societies organized themselves long before formal hierarchies emerged. As Chapter 1 closes, imagine the world before writing, before kings, before cities, a world lit by firelight and shaped by belief. In that quiet, expansive world, myth and identity began their slow dance, weaving themselves together until they became inseparable. And at the center of that dance stood the early seeds of the Nephilim narrative, not as a story of fear, but as a story of origins. Now, with that foundation laid, we're ready to step into the next chapter, where the story shifts from ordinary communities to the rising families and leaders who recognized the power of myth and began shaping it consciously. Chapter 2: When Leaders Discovered the Power of Myth. As human societies grew from scattered villages into structured communities, leadership shifted from something informal and situational into something more organized and enduring. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for a leader to be strong, charismatic, or wise. People wanted continuity. They wanted stability. They wanted to know that the person guiding their community wasn't just effective, but destined. And this is the moment when ancient leaders began to recognize an opportunity. Myth wasn't just a story, it was a resource. Imagine a small settlement turning gradually into a town. Houses become sturdier, marketplaces appear, roles become specialized. People begin thinking beyond the next season and toward the next generation. In this growing world, leaders need justification that extends beyond personality. They need legitimacy, and legitimacy in the ancient world came from ancestry. Not necessarily factual ancestry, but meaningful ancestry. Ancestry that connected the present to the cosmic order. If a leader could tie his lineage to a time when the world felt closer to the divine, his authority gained a kind of gravitational pull. People wouldn't just follow him, they would believe in him. This is where the Nephilim myth subtly entered the political sphere, not dramatically, not with proclamations or inscriptions, but quietly, through lineage. A leader who was taller, stronger, or unusually skilled became associated with ancient hybrid beings. A family that repeatedly produced effective chiefs gained a reputation for old blood. These associations didn't require explicit claims. They grew naturally from the stories people already believed. The extraordinary demanded extraordinary explanations, and leaders understood that leaning into this expectation made their positions more secure. What makes this period fascinating is that leaders did not invent myths to manipulate people. They used myths people already believed, and because those myths were deeply tied to cultural memory, tying oneself to them felt authentic. A leader who traced his ancestry to the age of the mighty ones was not lying in the eyes of his community. He was situating himself within the only framework that made sense to them. His lineage wasn't just a record, it was a continuation of a story. As time passed, leaders started to formalize these connections. Families began preserving genealogical information more carefully. Elders recited ancestry at ceremonies. Marriages between prominent families were framed not only as political alliances, but as the joining of ancient lines. And because the Nephilim myth represented the earliest and most extraordinary stage of human history, linking one's lineage to that story instantly elevated a family's status. Picture a young leader preparing to address his community after a tribal council. Before he speaks, an elder introduces him by citing his lineage. The lineage flows backward through known ancestors and eventually into a symbolic era tied to beings of great renown. No one thinks of this as exaggeration. It is simply how identity works. The elder is reminding the community that their leader is not starting from nothing. He stands on a foundation that stretches into mythic time. This creates a sense of continuity, a feeling that the present is connected to something ancient and stable. And in a world where instability was a constant threat, stability was a luxury. What's interesting is that these early claims of ancient lineage were never framed in dramatic terms. No one declared, "I descend from giants." Instead, language remained gentle and symbolic. Our ancestors were mighty. Our forefathers came from the early days. Our line touches the age when the Watchers walked the earth. These phrases were both literal and metaphorical, and ancient people didn't see a need to distinguish the two. Myth wasn't the opposite of truth. It was a deeper kind of truth, one that gave meaning to the ordinary world. But once leaders realized the stabilizing power of mythic lineage, they began to use it intentionally. The shift was subtle. A genealogy might be recited more frequently. A storyteller might emphasize certain ancestors. A leader might sponsor rituals that highlighted continuity with ancient times, and gradually, myth and power became intertwined, not through deception, but through shared belief. This interplay between myth and authority had a profound psychological impact. If people believed their leader carried ancient blood, they would trust his instincts, they would follow him into difficult decisions, they would interpret his successes as signs of cosmic favor and his failures as temporary imbalances. Leadership became not just a role, but a destiny, and destiny is one of the most persuasive forms of legitimacy. This belief didn't only affect leaders, it affected entire families. Clans with mythic ancestry gained influence simply by existing. Their children were treated differently. Their wealth, when it appeared, seemed meant to be. Their misfortunes were seen as omens. They became living embodiments of the old stories. And because identity is a powerful motivator, these families often lived up to the expectations people placed upon them. They carried themselves differently. They trained their children more rigorously. They made decisions with a sense of inherited responsibility. In this way, myth created reality. A family believed to come from ancient hybrid ancestors became influential not because of supernatural blood, but because the belief itself changed how everyone behaved. A leader believed to have Nephilim origins made bolder decisions. His people trusted him more. His rivals respected him more. Myth created confidence. Confidence created authority. Authority created stability. And stability reinforced the myth. This cycle created the first recognizable elite lineages. Families that held power for generations began to describe their ancestry in increasingly grand terms, while ordinary people traced their lineage to a handful of generations. Elite families stretched theirs into the mythic past. Not all referenced the Nephilim specifically. Some claimed descent from culture heroes, ancient kings, spirit-guided ancestors, or divine messengers. But the pattern was the same. Elite families needed ancient roots. The more ancient, the better. This trend was not unique to one culture. It appeared across the Near East, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Before kings claimed divine right, before empires constructed elaborate histories, the earliest leaders were already positioning themselves within myth. And the Nephilim, as beings associated with the dawn of civilization, provided the perfect narrative bridge between the human and the extraordinary. But this shift also planted the seeds for something more complex. Once myth becomes lineage, lineage becomes political. And once lineage becomes political, it becomes a tool. The next stage of the story, which we will explore in the coming segments, involves rulers who recognized the power of myth not just for legitimacy, but for control. Myth would move from fireside tradition into palace halls, shaping dynasties, priesthoods, and eventually entire civilizations. For now, as this segment closes, imagine the early leaders who first recognized that myth could do more than explain the world. It could organize it. They weren't manipulating belief. They were participating in a shared understanding of existence, but their embrace of myth began a transformation that would echo through history. From ordinary families telling fireside stories about extraordinary ancestors, to elites discovering that those stories could define who ruled and why. As ancient communities transformed into more structured societies, the families who held authority began noticing something important. Myth didn't just explain power, it amplified it. A story that placed a family's origins in the distant, enchanted past carried emotional weight. It made leadership feel inevitable, timeless, almost sacred. And once leaders recognized the strength of these stories, they began shaping them deliberately. This is the moment when myth crossed a subtle line and became a tool. Picture a leader preparing to settle a dispute between two clans. The gathering is tense, the stakes are high, but before any discussion begins, an elder recites the leader's lineage, not in the dry manner of a bureaucratic record, but in the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. Names unfold like a path leading back to a time when the world was new. Ancestors described as mighty, renowned, or of the early days, anchor the present moment in something older and larger than the dispute at hand. By the time the lineage is finished, the leader's authority feels natural, not imposed, not negotiated, but inherited. This wasn't manipulation. It was ritual, and rituals are powerful because they connect people to shared meaning. When a community hears a lineage that traces back to ancient figures, they aren't thinking about literal giants or supernatural beings. They're thinking about continuity, stability, and the belief that some families are meant to guide the rest. Myth became the invisible architecture supporting the visible structure of authority. But once leaders understood this dynamic, they began using it with more intention. Lineage no longer drifted casually through memory. It was curated, shaped, strengthened. A family that wanted to secure its position might emphasize certain ancestors more than others. They might highlight a connection to a legendary figure, a warrior of renown, or a name associated with the ancient hybrid beings of early myth. And because these genealogies existed mostly in oral form at first, there was room for reinterpretation. Not fabrication, reinterpretation, the kind of reshaping that feels natural when stories are passed through generations. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room as a scribe listens to a family recount its ancestry. They describe their forefathers, their achievements, their migrations, their alliances. When they reach the distant past, they speak more slowly, choosing their words carefully. They describe ancestors who lived before the great changes, in the days when the Watchers were among us, or when the mighty walked the land. The scribe writes these words down, and just like that, the family's lineage is anchored in myth. This anchoring mattered because it provided a foundation for authority that could not be easily challenged. You could question a leader's decisions. You could question a leader's skills. But questioning a leader's lineage, the very story that shaped a community's sense of identity, was far more difficult. Doing so wasn't merely political. It was cultural, emotional, and even spiritual. The psychological impact of this was profound. Leaders raised to believe their lineage connected them to ancient beings carried themselves differently. They made decisions with a quiet sense of destiny. Their confidence inspired followers. Their followers' loyalty reinforced their power. Myth and psychology worked together in a way that felt seamless. This process wasn't isolated to one culture. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers linked themselves to semi-divine figures from the pre-flood era, the same era associated with the Nephilim in other traditions. In the Levant, families with long-standing influence often recalled ancestors who stood apart or walked with the early ones. These phrases weren't meant to be literal. They were symbolic references to a mythic age that gave their lineage weight, but the most important transformation came when these lineages began to influence political structure. As city-states formed, leadership became hereditary, and once leadership became hereditary, the question became, why this family? Why not another? Mythic ancestry offered the answer. A lineage linked to ancient beings seemed destined for leadership, And once people accepted that premise, it shaped the development of early aristocracies. You can imagine how this shaped daily life. Children born into elite families were reminded of their ancient origins from an early age. They learned their genealogies the way modern children learn their names. They were told that their courage, intelligence, or stature reflected the old blood running through their veins. This produced generations of leaders who internalized their own myth, not arrogantly, simply as their identity. An identity is powerful. Meanwhile, ordinary people accepted these claims not because they were forced to, but because the structure made sense. If the world had once been filled with extraordinary beings, then it was natural that their descendants would lead. Myth and hierarchy reinforced each other. Leaders seemed destined, followers felt protected. The system functioned because it aligned with the way people understood the world. But as these societies became more complex, something new emerged: competition. Elite families began distinguishing their lineages from one another. If one family claimed descent from ancient hybrid beings, another might claim descent from a legendary hero, a divine messenger, or a figure associated with early kingship. The mythic past became a symbolic landscape, and lineages became pathways through it. This competition didn't create tension at first. Instead, it strengthened the overall structure. The more families traced their roots to mythic origins, the more people accepted that leadership naturally derived from ancient blood. It created an elite class whose identity was shaped as much by story as by wealth or influence. But inevitably, this process had consequences. Once leaders realized myth could justify power, some began pushing the boundaries. Genealogies grew longer. The mythic elements became more pronounced. Some lineages stretched implausibly far into the past. Others incorporated figures from entirely different traditions. And although most people accepted these claims, there were always a few who raised quiet questions. Not openly, that would be dangerous, but privately, in moments of uncertainty. These doubts didn't weaken the system, they strengthened it. They led leaders to reinforce their genealogies more carefully. They prompted communities to create rituals that honored mythic ancestors. They inspired scribes to record genealogies more formally. Stories that once existed only in memory became etched into clay tablets or inked onto scrolls. And once they were written, they gained an aura of permanence that oral tradition could never provide. This shift marks the boundary between early leadership and true aristocracy, the moment when myth became not just a belief, but a document, a lineage you could point to, a story that carried the weight of ink. And because writing preserved these genealogies unchanged across generations, the mythic elements embedded within them became unassailable. They became tradition, and tradition, especially in ancient societies, held immense authority. As this segment concludes, imagine the growing sophistication of early cities, the quiet rise of scribal schools, the increasing complexity of religious rituals, the careful preservation of genealogies in temple archives. In this world, myth was no longer merely a story told around a fire. It had become part of the infrastructure of power. The Nephilim myth, once a reflection of awe, was now a foundation for elite identity. The next segment will explore how this foundation evolved into explicit royal doctrine, how kings and rulers across ancient civilizations actively reshaped myth to solidify their legitimacy and create dynasties that linked themselves not only to ancient beings, but to the cosmic order itself. As small communities expanded into kingdoms and kingdoms grew into early states, the relationship between myth and power deepened. Leaders were no longer chosen only for their personal abilities. They were chosen for what their lineage represented. And once rulers realized that people responded to mythic ancestry with trust, reverence, and obedience, they began codifying these stories into the fabric of governance itself. This was the moment when myth didn't just support power, it became doctrine. Imagine an early king standing before his people preparing for a coronation ceremony in the courtyard of a growing city. Instead of making a speech about policy or plans, he begins by invoking his ancestors, not just his father or grandfather, but the distant, shimmering lineage that reaches into the mythic past. Names are spoken that describe individuals mighty in the early days, closer to the divine, or born before the old world changed. This isn't entertainment, it's legitimacy. It anchors his authority not in temporary circumstances but in ancient continuity. And the people listening don't question it, they're comforted by it. They want their ruler to come from a story larger than life. This was the beginning of royal myth-making, not deception, but interpretation. Every king needed a story that framed his rule within a cosmic order. In Egypt, this became formal theology. The pharaoh was literally the son of a god, a living bridge between the divine and the human. In Mesopotamia, kings were said to be shaped by gods or descended from heroes who lived before the Great Flood, the same era associated with the Nephilim in neighboring traditions. These weren't optional claims, they were requirements. A ruler without mythic ancestry seemed incomplete, even dangerous. People didn't want leaders who emerged suddenly. They wanted leaders who emerged inevitably. As royal courts developed, scribes became the architects of these genealogies. Their skill allowed them to record lineages stretching hundreds of years into the past, weaving together history, legend, and early mythic memory. A genealogy didn't need to be perfectly accurate. It needed to be meaningful. It needed to tie the present ruler to a story that felt as old as the world itself. When scribes connected a king's ancestors to legendary figures, early watchers, or mighty beings from the dawn of civilization, they weren't writing fiction. They were writing identity. And once written, identity became extremely difficult to challenge. Picture a scribe in a quiet chamber writing by lamplight. Outside, the city hums with life, but inside, he is shaping the political destiny of a dynasty. Every line he writes strengthens the king's claim. Every name he adds from the mythic past reinforces the idea that the ruler's bloodline contains something extraordinary. And by formalizing these details, he transforms oral myth into state doctrine. This shift created a new relationship between myth and authority. Leaders were no longer powerful individuals who happened to have mythic ancestry. They became embodiments of the myth itself. Their physical bodies, their decisions, their ceremonies, all were framed as continuations of a story that began before the memory of humankind. The ruler represented not just political stability, but cosmic balance. His lineage was not just old, it was sacred. This produced an elite class that seemed fundamentally different from ordinary people, not because they truly carried supernatural traits, but because the stories surrounding them said they did. A peasant in the fields could question another peasant, but questioning someone believed to descend from beings associated with the creation of the world felt like questioning the structure of reality itself. Myth created distance. That distance created reverence, and reverence created obedience. But even more than obedience, myth created expectation. Rulers raised within these traditions learned to see themselves as participants in something ancient and ongoing. They believed their role was ordained by their ancestry. This belief shaped how they governed. Many acted with confidence bordering on inevitability. They made decisions with a sense of inherited destiny, and their people, seeing that confidence, were reassured. A ruler who believed in his own myth was far more persuasive than one who didn't. This is also where the earliest hints of elite bloodlines begin to appear. Once rulers formalized their genealogies, families who supported them, priests, nobles, advisors, began crafting their own lineages to match. Not as grand as the royal line, but still anchored in ancient stories. These lineages helped secure their positions within the hierarchy. They became part of an interconnected web of mythic ancestry, creating a social structure that felt ordained rather than constructed. The myth of the Nephilim, whether explicitly mentioned or quietly alluded to, offered a convenient framework for describing these early hierarchies. Over time, this system became self-reinforcing. A child born into a royal family wasn't simply raised to rule. They were raised to embody the myth. Their education emphasized their ancient origins. Their ceremonies highlighted their continuity with the past. Their advisors reminded them of the responsibilities of their lineage. Some royal families even performed rituals symbolically linking the present ruler to ancient beings or divine ancestors. These rituals weren't theatrical, they were psychological reinforcements of identity. And identity became destiny. But this period wasn't without tension. As rulers embraced mythic ancestry more explicitly, rival families did the same. Some lineages stretched their origins so far into the mythic past that their claims began to overlap or contradict each other. Scribes occasionally adjusted genealogies to resolve disputes. Priests interpreted myths in ways that supported one royal line over another. Stories once shaped by communities now became instruments shaped by elites. Myth was no longer purely organic, it was curated, yet despite these complexities, ordinary people continued to accept the system. Why? Because it aligned with their worldview. Ancient societies saw the universe as layered and interconnected. The divine realm influenced the human realm not symbolically but literally. Believing that rulers descended from ancient beings fit naturally into this understanding. It made the world feel coherent, it made leaders feel chosen, and it made the struggles of everyday life feel connected to something meaningful. This coherence mattered deeply. In a world shaped by unpredictable weather, disease, and conflict, the idea that leaders were part of an ancient cosmic plan offered comfort. Even if a ruler was harsh or imperfect, his lineage made sense. It explained his authority. It offered reassurance that his decisions, even when difficult, were part of a larger order. By the end of this period, myth had fully become doctrine. The Nephilim, once a symbol of awe and difference, had become a quiet, influential thread running through royal identity. Their story offered the earliest blueprint for elite bloodlines, ancient origins, extraordinary ancestors, inherited authority, and connection to a time when the world felt closer to the divine. This segment marks a turning point. Up until now, myth and lineage evolved organically, but in the next segment, we will see myth's deliberate transformation into political architecture, how rulers used these stories to construct dynasties, shape religion, and create lasting systems of power that would echo across millennia. By the time early kingdoms matured into structured states, myth had already proven itself to be more than a cultural story. It had become a political instrument, and in this final phase of Chapter 2, we enter the era when rulers didn't simply inherit myth, they engineered it. They shaped their genealogies with precision, curated their ancestral stories with purpose, and built dynasties upon foundations that blended history, legend, and cosmic symbolism. The Nephilim myth, once a quiet explanation for human difference, now became part of a deliberate architecture of power. Imagine a throne room carved from stone, lit by torches that flicker against murals depicting ancient battles and divine encounters. A ruler sits above his council, not simply as a political authority, but as the living representation of an ancient story. Around him stand advisors, priests, scribes, and nobles, all of whom have genealogies that connect in one way or another to mythic origins. The air carries a sense of ritual. Everything from the throne's carvings to the ceremonial robes speaks to lineage. Identity isn't just worn, it's displayed. This is the era when myth became fully embedded into governance. Rulers weren't just descendants of ancient beings. They were custodians of a lineage that shaped the identity of the entire state. Their ancestry didn't simply justify their position, it defined the nation's memory. To question the ruler's lineage would be to question the story the entire society used to understand itself. This is where the Nephilim myth, sometimes explicitly referenced and sometimes absorbed into local equivalents, became structurally important. Kings and elites claimed descent not only from divine beings, but from figures described in old texts as possessing extraordinary strength, wisdom, or presence. These claims didn't surprise people, they comforted them. A king descended from mighty ancestors seemed equipped to face the challenges of the world. His victories became confirmations of lineage. His failures were interpreted through the lens of ancient omens. And behind the scenes, scribes shaped these genealogies with care. They recorded names meticulously, aligned the stories with religious traditions, and ensured that each generation linked cleanly to the next. If inconsistencies appeared, they were smoothed over. If rival claims emerged, genealogical revisions were quietly made to reinforce legitimacy. Scribes weren't lying, not in the way we think of the word. They were preserving meaning. They saw their work as aligning reality with cosmic truth, and the cosmic truth was simple. Certain families descended from ancient beings, and that descent shaped the destiny of the state. In some cultures, the Nephilim-like ancestry became tied to divine kingship. In others, it became associated with the right to lead armies or oversee religious rituals. But in all cases, the myth served one consistent function. It created a lineage so old, so symbolically rich, that no ordinary challenge could undermine it. A ruler wasn't just a man, he was a node in an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of the world. This belief shaped how societies approached succession. A king's heir needed to demonstrate continuity, not merely capability. Ceremonies emphasized the transfer of ancient essence. Rituals invoked the memory of mythic ancestors. Advisors reminded the heir of the weight of his lineage. As a result, rulers often saw themselves not as individuals, but as embodiments of a story much older than their own lives. Their decisions reflected this. Even when they acted impulsively or cruelly, they justified their choices through the lens of destiny. Rulers who believed they carried ancient blood rarely questioned whether they deserved their position. They questioned whether others deserved to challenge them. Meanwhile, the broader population internalized these narratives. Farmers, artisans, soldiers, traders, all saw the ruler's lineage as part of the natural order. They didn't need to believe literally in giant ancestors. They simply accepted that their rulers came from different stock, that their lives followed a different path marked by ancient history. This belief created predictability, and predictability in an unpredictable world offered reassurance. It also created hierarchy. and hierarchy hardened over time. Families with mythic lineages gained access to education, wealth, and religious authority. Families without such claims remained lower in status, regardless of personal talent or achievement. This wasn't seen as unfair. It was seen as cosmic structure, the universe assigning roles according to ancestry. And yet, within this structure, communities found meaning. They saw themselves as part of a narrative that stretched backward into myth and forward into unknown generations. Their ruler anchored that narrative. His lineage gave their society identity, and that identity made hardship more bearable. But while myth created order, it also created pressure. Rulers were expected to live up to their ancestry. A king who failed spectacularly wasn't merely seen as incompetent. He was seen as betraying the ancient story his lineage carried. Priests interpreted natural disasters as signs that the ruler had lost divine favor. Rivals used mythic inconsistencies to challenge authority. Genealogy became both shield and sword, powerful but demanding. This dynamic led some rulers to reinforce their mythic lineage through architectural and cultural projects. Temples were dedicated to ancestors, monuments depicted scenes from ancient myth, ceremonies reenacted cosmic events. All of this served to remind the population, and sometimes the ruler himself, that the dynasty's power was rooted in something deeper than politics. It was rooted in identity, narrative, and the primal human need for meaning. This is also where dynasties began to develop origin myths that mirrored the structure of the Nephilim narrative, even when they didn't use the name directly. Heroes born of divine unions, kings who descended from sky spirits, rulers whose ancestors survived great floods, cosmic wars, or supernatural transformations. These weren't embellishments, they were cultural cornerstones. They allowed people to see their leaders as living symbols of an ancient, ongoing story. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. Extraordinary ancestors, mythic lineage, elite identity, dynastic stability. Whether those ancestors were called Watchers, gods, titans, demigods, or Nephilim didn't matter. What mattered was the structure of the story. Power comes from ancient origins, and those origins set the rulers apart. By the end of this era, myth had become fully institutionalized. The Nephilim were no longer just beings from old stories. They were part of the conceptual framework that shaped how societies understood power, and their role would only grow more complex as religions evolved, empires expanded, and the idea of elite bloodlines took on new and unintended interpretations. As this segment closes, picture a ruler gazing across his kingdom from a palace balcony, convinced that the weight in his bones is not just responsibility, but ancestry, ancient, symbolic, and essential. He believes he is part of a story the universe has been telling since the beginning. And whether true or not, that belief shapes the world around him. Chapter 3. The Nephilim Reinterpreted, when myth became mystery. By the time early states gave way to larger civilizations, the stories surrounding ancient hybrid beings had already woven themselves deeply into cultural identity. But something interesting happened as societies matured. People didn't abandon these stories. Instead, they reinterpreted them. What was once a gentle explanation for human difference and later a tool for elite identity slowly transformed into a deeper mystery, one that blended theology, memory, anxiety, and awe. This shift marks the beginning of the Nephilim as we recognize them today. Enigmatic, elusive, and strangely persistent in the collective imagination. Imagine an ancient library, its walls lined with clay tablets or scrolls. each containing fragments of older stories. Scholars sit in quiet corners, copying and recopying texts, preserving the voices of generations long gone. As they work, they encounter references to ancient beings who lived before floods, before kingdoms, before written language. Some texts describe them as mighty warriors, others describe them as fallen, others barely mention them as though the writers assumed everyone already knew the details. And that's where the mystery begins. In the gaps, the Nephilim appear briefly in various traditions, as though they were too well known to require explanation. But as time passed, the memories faded, leaving only fragments. People filled those fragments with interpretation. In some cultures, the Nephilim became symbols of an age when the world was more dangerous and more enchanted. In others, they became reminders of what happens when cosmic boundaries are crossed. And in still others, they were folded quietly into theological systems as cautionary figures whose existence hinted at the complexity of divine order. The ambiguity gave them power. The less clearly people understood them, the more fascinated they became. This reinterpretation wasn't driven by fear. It was driven by curiosity, the same kind of curiosity that keeps you thinking about something even after you turn off the light. Ancient storytellers didn't always know exactly what the Nephilim represented anymore, but they knew the myth meant something. It tapped into a sense of loss, a sense that the world had once been stranger and larger, and that something from that age still lingered in the shadows of collective memory. This was also a time when theological movements were reshaping entire civilizations. As monotheistic beliefs expanded, old myths were revisited and reframed. The Nephilim, once symbolic ancestors of elites, became part of a larger story about cosmic order, rebellion, and the dangers of crossing boundaries between realms. People read old lines differently. Where earlier generations saw mighty ones, later readers saw warnings. They imagined the Nephilim not as noble ancestors, but as reminders of a world out of balance. This shift created a new kind of fascination. The Nephilim were no longer just figures of the past. They became symbols, ambiguous, atmospheric, and haunting. When a text mentioned them briefly, that brevity made them more intriguing. The less said, the more people wanted to know. At the same time, neighboring cultures contributed their own interpretations. Greek myths described titans and demigods. Babylonian traditions referenced pre-flood kings of great stature. Canaanite stories described ancient warriors whose origins were older than their lands. These narratives weren't identical, but they shared a rhythm. Powerful beings existed in the ancient past, and the world we inherited is merely a quieter echo of that era. When stories resonate across cultures like this, people begin to sense a pattern, not a literal one, but an emotional one, a feeling that humanity's earliest ancestors lived closer to the extraordinary. And when a myth becomes emotionally true, it survives even when historical details fade. This is the era when the Nephilim shift from explanation to symbol. They become the representation of an ancient mystery that refuses to settle neatly into doctrine. They are neither fully divine nor fully human. They are beings that existed in the cracks of cosmology, where humans weren't meant to tread. And because they stood at the boundary between worlds, later interpreters treated them with caution. But this caution wasn't rooted in fear of giants or monsters. It was rooted in theological anxiety, the anxiety that occurs when stories challenge the neat boundaries religion tries to draw. If ancient beings existed who didn't fit cleanly into categories, what did that say about the structure of the universe? What did it say about the nature of rebellion, transgression, or divine will? Religious commentators wrestled with these questions quietly. Some downplayed the Nephilim, reducing them to footnotes. Others expanded their role, interpreting them as symbols of corruption or imbalance. And still others saw them as part of a cosmic drama that shaped the world before humanity fully understood itself. These interpretations varied, but they all did something important. They kept the myth alive. Meanwhile, ordinary people encountered these ideas indirectly through rituals, stories, and conversations. They didn't see the Nephilim as literal threats. They saw them as part of a mythic landscape that explained why ancient ruins felt so imposing, why old mountains looked like sleeping giants, why early dynasties possessed an aura of otherworldly influence. And as these stories trickled down through time, they gained something new: ambiguity. Ambiguity is powerful because it allows myth to evolve. A story that is too clear cannot adapt. A story that is too vague cannot survive. The Nephilim myth balanced perfectly between clarity and mystery. We know just enough to be intrigued. We know too little to be satisfied. That tension kept the myth alive through centuries of cultural transformation. It isn't difficult to imagine conversations happening across ancient generations, each adding a layer of interpretation. One storyteller imagines the Nephilim as warriors of legendary strength. Another imagines them as fallen beings. Another imagines them as tragic figures caught between worlds. Over time, these layers accumulate, and the myth becomes a mosaic, a story made of stories. This mosaic quality is what later led people to speculate about secret bloodlines. If ancient beings once walked the earth, and if their influence lingered, then perhaps the families who held power in later eras inherited something from them. This wasn't a conspiracy idea originally. It was a theological metaphor, a symbolic way of saying that some families carried traits shaped by ancient history. But metaphors have a way of slipping into literal interpretations, especially when scattered fragments feed the imagination. By the time this reinterpretation reached the classical world, the Nephilim were no longer just ancient figures. They were mysteries. Mysteries of ancestry, mysteries of early humanity, mysteries that bridge the gap between myth and memory. As this segment ends, imagine standing in an ancient city as night falls. The stone walls still hold the warmth of the day. The stars appear overhead, bright and unfiltered by modern light. Somewhere in the silence, someone mentions the old beings, the ones who lived before the world settled into the shape we know. They aren't speaking with fear, they're speaking with wonder. A wonder that says the past was larger than the present, and that somewhere in that largeness lies a story we have never fully understood. As ancient civilizations refined their belief systems, something subtle but profound happened to the old myths. The Nephilim, once understood as part of the natural landscape of human origins, were slowly drawn into the emerging frameworks of theology. Religion, especially when it sought to explain the order of the universe, had to decide what to do with beings who didn't fit neatly into categories. And because the Nephilim existed at the crossroads between human and divine, theology couldn't ignore them, but it couldn't fully embrace them either. That tension shaped centuries of interpretation. Imagine a group of early theologians gathered in a quiet courtyard, reading from older stories and trying to reconcile them with new understandings of divine order. These scholars looked back at ancient texts that described powerful beings who lived long before their own time. The descriptions were vague, almost teasing. The Nephilim were called mighty men, men of renown, or simply figures from the days of old. But the lack of detail created a challenge. How could these beings fit into a theological system that emphasized clear moral boundaries and a structured universe? They couldn't be ignored. They were too deeply embedded in the cultural memory, but they needed reinterpretation. So theologians reframed them. Instead of focusing on the physical or heroic aspects of the Nephilim, religious interpreters emphasized their symbolic meaning. They became examples of what happens when cosmic boundaries are crossed. In traditions where divine beings were expected to remain separate from humanity, the Nephilim represented a breach, a moment when order gave way to disorder. This didn't make the Nephilim villains, it made them cautionary figures. Their existence served as a reminder that the universe had rules, and breaking those rules created consequence. This shift from historical beings to symbols of imbalance fundamentally changed how later generations understood them. They were no longer simply part of ancient lineage stories. They became part of theological discourse, a way to explain why the early world seemed so different, so chaotic, so full of strange figures who didn't resemble ordinary people. And because theology often seeks to establish order, the Nephilim became associated with the era before that order fully emerged. This reinterpretation also influenced how people read older texts. When someone encountered a brief reference to the Nephilim, they didn't imagine literal giants wandering the landscape. They imagined beings whose existence represented a disruption in the harmony of creation. The lack of detail became part of the mystique. Theologically, mystery isn't a flaw, it's a tool. A symbol that resists clear explanation can point toward deeper truths. At the same time, other cultures were developing parallel ideas. The ancient Greeks described titans who fell from divine privilege. Mesopotamian stories referenced pre-flood kings whose stature was greater than later humans. Canaanite mythology described semi-divine warriors born from unions between gods and mortals. These stories weren't identical, but they shared a pattern. Beings who stood between worlds, whose existence preceded the structured societies that followed. When different cultures create similar myths, theologians take notice. Some saw this as evidence that the ancient world was once filled with extraordinary beings, remembered differently across civilizations. Others saw it as a sign that humanity carries a collective memory of a world that no longer exists. Either interpretation deepened the mystery, and mysteries, especially those rooted in shared memory, tend to persist. As monotheistic traditions strengthened, the Nephilim took on additional layers of meaning. In some interpretations, they became symbols of human arrogance, a reminder that humanity once lived in proximity to beings of immense power and was humbled by the consequences. In others, they became associated with spiritual corruption, representing the dangers of mixing the earthly and the divine. None of these interpretations presented them as monsters. They were treated more like shadows, reminders of a world that blurred boundaries and required correction. This theological framing also changed how people understood ancient ruins and unexplained feats of architecture. When someone encountered massive stones or monumental structures from earlier civilizations, they sometimes attributed them to ancient giants, not necessarily because they believed in literal giants, but because they sensed that the early world was fundamentally different. If the Nephilim represented the ancient age of blurring, then the ruins left behind by early cultures felt like echoes of that age. People weren't saying, giants built this, they were saying, this belongs to a time when the world was bigger, stranger, and more powerful than it is now. This sense of ancient largeness shaped theological imagination for centuries. Even when people didn't speak about the Nephilim directly, the idea of an earlier world filled with beings who exceeded modern humanity lingered in sermons, stories, and sacred texts. It's the same emotional current you feel when reading about ancient patriarchs who lived for centuries or seeing ruins that seem almost too immense for their time. The ancient world feels amplified, and the Nephilim became part of that amplification. As theology continued to evolve, the Nephilim's role became even more symbolic. They represented the early chaos before divine order took full root. They represented the mixing of realms that should have remained separate. They represented the extraordinary nature of the world before the world became ordinary. And because symbolism is flexible, each generation found new meaning in them. Some theologians treated the Nephilim as a historical footnote, an explanation for why ancient genealogies suddenly changed before a flood narrative. Others placed them within moral frameworks, cautioning against metaphorical mixing of boundaries in everyday life. Still others saw them as reminders of humanity's fascination with power and origins. The ambiguity allowed the myth to stretch, adapting to new cultural needs without losing its core identity. Meanwhile, these theological interpretations eventually filtered into common understanding. Ordinary people didn't read scholarly texts, but they heard stories shaped by theological ideas. They heard that the ancient world was filled with beings who challenged the divine order. They heard that events in the distant past had cosmic significance. They heard that the earliest humans lived in an age where extraordinary beings walked among them. And because these stories were told gently, symbolically, and without sensationalism, they settled comfortably into the imagination. This created a kind of quiet mystery around ancestry. People understood that their lineage was human, of course, but they also sensed that humanity had roots extending into a more enchanted era. When religious texts mentioned mighty men of old, people pictured not literal giants, but figures who carried the weight of ancient history. And because elites often traced their lineage into the deep past, the theological framing made those claims feel even more significant. The Nephilim, once ordinary parts of mythic ancestry, had become theological symbols woven into the structure of belief. Their meaning expanded, contracted, and transformed depending on the needs of the culture interpreting them. As this segment closes, imagine a quiet temple at dawn. A priest sweeps the floor, preparing for morning rituals. On a shelf rests a scroll containing a brief mention of ancient beings who lived before the flood. The priest doesn't fear these beings. He doesn't imagine them literally. He simply sees them as markers of a time when creation was still taking shape. A reminder that the world carries layers of memory, some clear, some hazy, all meaningful. This gentle symbolic framing created the bridge that future generations would later cross when they began wondering whether echoes of these beings might still remain in certain families, hidden within the upper tiers of society. As civilizations rose and fell, they left behind ruins that puzzled the generations that followed. Towering stone walls, massive foundations, megalithic blocks shaped with impossible precision. All of it raised quiet questions in the minds of ancient observers. They didn't have archaeological methods. They didn't analyze carbon samples or catalog architectural techniques. Instead, they approached these sites with imagination and reverence, and that is where the Nephilim myth found fertile ground. The old stories of ancient beings already carrying theological weight now acquired a tangible dimension, physical places that seemed to belong to a world larger and older than their own. Imagine a group of travelers approaching a ruin half swallowed by time. Vines drape the stones. Wind moves through empty corridors. The scale feels disproportionate, not monstrous, but grand enough that ordinary people instinctively sense the work of hands not quite like their own. They pause, they exchange glances, and someone quietly says, "This was built in the days of the mighty ones." Not a literal claim, not a statement of fact, but a way of giving shape to the awe they feel. This kind of moment happened across centuries, across continents, across cultures. Ancient ruins offered mystery. The Nephilim offered an explanation. This wasn't superstition, it was interpretation. People living in later eras assumed earlier generations were stronger, braver, more capable. It's the same feeling you get when looking at ancient structures today, a sense that our ancestors tapped into power or knowledge we don't fully understand. The Nephilim myth became a symbolic bridge between the known and the unknown. When a structure exceeded the expectations of an era, people didn't conclude that ordinary humans built it. They concluded that extraordinary ancestors once walked the land. This interpretation grew even stronger in regions where flood narratives persisted. A ruin built upon older foundations seemed like a remnant of the pre-flood world, the same world where the Nephilim once lived, according to early traditions. The idea wasn't always expressed directly, but it lingered just beneath the surface of collective memory. Ancient people didn't see time as a linear progression. They saw it as layers, with each layer carrying remnants of the one before. Ruins felt like doorways into the past, and the Nephilim myth offered the key. Over time, as theological interpretations reframed the Nephilim as symbols of imbalance, the ruins took on an additional dimension. They weren't just impressive, they were reminders of an age when humanity wandered closer to cosmic boundaries. Some storytellers used them as cautionary symbols, describing them as monuments to ancient arrogance. Others saw them as evidence that the early world held knowledge modern people had lost. These interpretations varied, but they all shared the same emotional root, the sense that the ancient world was fundamentally different. This feeling extended to artifacts as well. When unusually crafted tools or decorative objects were unearthed, people didn't analyze metallurgy or skill. They wondered who had made them and whether the makers possessed abilities humans no longer had. Even now, when we visit museums and see objects thousands of years old, the instinct is the same. We marvel at the detail, the craftsmanship, the precision, and we feel, quietly, that the people of the past were not as simple as we imagine. The Nephilim myth thrived in this emotional landscape. It didn't need explicit references. It simply hovered in the background whenever someone encountered something unexpectedly elegant or powerful from a bygone era. The myth acted like a placeholder, a way of saying, there was a time when the extraordinary was possible, and this is what remains. This interpretive habit strengthened over generations. As people encountered ruins, artifacts, or monumental structures, they built stories to explain them. Some described ancient kings of immense stature. Others spoke of beings who lived for centuries. Others imagined entire civilizations wiped out by floods or cosmic upheaval. These stories varied widely, yet they followed a consistent narrative. The ancient world was bigger, older, stronger, stranger. The Nephilim fit naturally into this narrative. They became symbols of how ancient humanity differed from modern humanity, not necessarily physically, but spiritually, intellectually, or cosmically. Their presence in myth explained why old ruins felt so charged with meaning. It explained why some lineages claimed deeper origins. It explained why early dynasties seemed larger than life, and because these explanations were gentle, metaphorical, and emotionally resonant, they persisted even as cultures changed. This dynamic grew more pronounced when urban centers collapsed. When cities fell and temples crumbled, later generations inherited only fragments, broken columns, scattered inscriptions, toppled walls. Without context, the ruins became mysterious, and mystery invites myth. A community finding the remains of a grand civilization might easily imagine that ancient beings once shaped the land. The Nephilim didn't have to be mentioned by name. The sensory experience of standing before monumental stone, feeling small, feeling connected to something distant, naturally evoked the old mythic patterns. Consider also the psychological effect of loss. When a civilization collapses, collective memory fractures. People know their ancestors achieved something remarkable, but they can't fully explain it. Into that gap, myths flow. They offer a narrative where explanations cannot. They comfort, soothe, and satisfy curiosity. The Nephilim, as markers of the ancient age, became a quiet explanation for achievements forgotten by time. This reinterpretation wasn't just about architecture or artifacts. It shaped how people understood ancestry itself. If ancient structures were built by extraordinary beings, perhaps the descendants of those beings still carried traces of their legacy. This idea wasn't framed conspiratorially in ancient times. It was framed symbolically. Some clans known for strength or wisdom were described as inheriting the old traits. These descriptions weren't literal. They were compliments, acknowledgments that certain families seemed touched by the greatness of earlier ages. But symbolism has a way of shifting into literal speculation, especially when historical context fades. Over centuries, as ruins continued to dwarf the imaginations of later generations, the gentle metaphor of descended from the mighty ones became more intriguing. People whispered about hidden lineages. They wondered whether powerful families retained ancient knowledge, ancient abilities, or ancient favor. These speculations often remained quiet, but they shaped how communities understood the relationship between the past and the present. By the time later, religious communities began cataloging their own genealogies and historical traditions, the world already felt layered with echoes of something older. The Nephilim symbolized that older world, not as monsters, but as markers of ancient grandeur. The ruins gave the myth shape, the artifacts gave the myth texture, and the lingering sense that humanity once touched something vast kept the myth alive long after its original context faded. As this segment closes, imagine walking through an ancient ruin at dusk. The air cools, the shadows lengthen, the stones glow softly in the fading light. You don't need to believe in giants or hybrid beings to feel the weight of the place. You simply sense that the world was once different, and that its traces still hum gently beneath your feet. That hum, that quiet emotional resonance, is exactly where myths like the Nephilim find their home. As centuries passed and civilizations layered new beliefs over older ones, the Nephilim myth drifted into a quieter, more speculative corner of human imagination. It no longer lived primarily in temples or genealogical recitations. It lived in questions people asked when they encountered families who seemed unusually powerful, unusually enduring, or unusually influential across generations. These weren't suspicious questions at first. They were reflections of a human tendency that had existed since the earliest days of myth-making, the belief that extraordinary people must come from extraordinary origins. By this point in history, the story of the Nephilim had already transformed several times. It began as an explanation for human difference. Then it became a tool for elite identity. Then it shifted into theological symbolism. And now it began taking on a more mysterious tone, not frightening, not conspiratorial, but quietly curious. People noticed that certain families maintained influence across centuries, even as the world around them changed dramatically. They wondered how these families preserved their status through wars, famines, religious upheavals, and political transitions. The myth of ancient blood offered a simple explanation. Imagine a merchant traveling through a wealthy district of an ancient city. He sees the same noble family's crest carved into city gates, temple columns, and civic buildings. Their influence feels older than the city itself. He might not know their full genealogy, but he senses a pattern. Some families seem woven into the fabric of history. He doesn't think of giants or supernatural hybrids. Instead, he feels the presence of old blood, a phrase whispered across cultures to describe lineages that seem to carry something rare and enduring. This phrase, old blood, is where the connection to the Nephilim myth resurfaces quietly, subtly, almost without intention. The original myth described beings of renown, exceptional individuals whose origins lay in a distant era when the world felt larger and more enchanted. When people described elite families as having old blood, they were not saying these families literally descended from such beings. They were drawing on the same emotional framework. The idea that greatness originates in the distant past and passes forward through lineage. Over time, as societies became more stratified, this idea grew stronger. Aristocracies formalized their genealogies. Priesthoods preserved their own sacred lineages. Ruling houses protected their bloodlines through carefully arranged marriages. And because these families documented their ancestry more thoroughly than others, they naturally appeared ancient, mysterious, and somehow connected to eras before common memory. This was not a conspiracy. It was structure, but structure often creates myths of its own. People in the ancient world didn't assume elites were hiding something supernatural. They simply felt that certain families were linked to the ancient past in ways that others were not. And because the Nephilim myth symbolized the ancient extraordinary, the connection formed naturally. The myth offered a narrative, not literal, not explicit, but metaphorical, to explain why some families seemed destined for prominence. This connection deepened when societies encountered ruins that outlasted their builders. A noble family living near such ruins might claim descent from the people who built them, not because they wanted to deceive others, but because they genuinely believed it. Humans anchor identity to place, and ancient places have a way of borrowing myth from the stories surrounding them. Over generations, those claims became embedded in local traditions, strengthening the sense that elite families carried ancient lineage. But as time continued to pass, history became more fragmented. Empires collapsed, cultures intermingled, kings rose and fell, genealogies were lost, rewritten, or absorbed into new political systems. The old stories remained, but their meanings grew more ambiguous. People still believed in old blood, but they no longer knew precisely where it came from. Into this uncertainty, the Nephilim myth drifted quietly, offering itself as an explanation for the unexplained endurance of elite families. In many ways, the myth's power lay in its gentleness. It didn't demand belief. It didn't insist on literal interpretation. It simply hovered in the background, providing a symbolic language for ancestry and influence. When a family seemed unusually capable or unusually lucky, people said they carried ancient traits. When a dynasty rose quickly, people said the old strength had returned. These descriptions were rooted in mythic memory, not in literal conviction. But mythology has a way of influencing perception. When people believe a family carries ancient lineage, even metaphorically, they treat them differently. That treatment reinforces the family's power, and that power in turn reinforces the myth. Myths endure not because they are factual, but because they become entangled with real structures that outlast generations. The Nephilim myth persisted because it explained patterns people observed but couldn't fully articulate. This period also marked the beginning of hidden interpretations. Not hidden in the sense of secret societies or conspiracies, but hidden in the sense that people began referencing ancient ancestry indirectly. They spoke in symbols, they spoke in hints, they spoke in phrases like chosen people, ancient houses, or families touched by the early days. These phrases echoed the Nephilim myth without naming it. Over time, the echoes grew louder than the original story, and because these echoes were subtle, they blended seamlessly with religious, cultural, and political narratives. They gave people a way to talk about influence without accusing elites of anything supernatural. They gave elites a way to claim prestige without making overt mythic claims. It created a quiet equilibrium, myth supporting identity, identity reinforcing myth. By the time the classical world emerged, the Nephilim myth had become something like a shadow beneath ancestry. It wasn't the main story. It wasn't spoken directly. But when people encountered lineages that felt impossibly old, impossibly wealthy, or impossibly influential, the old mythic framework stirred gently in the background. It whispered a simple idea. Some origins reach farther back than others. As this segment closes, imagine walking through an ancient marketplace at dusk. Vendors call out their final prices. Smoke drifts from clay ovens. Families hurry home before the lamps burn out. Among them walks a young noble, wearing simple clothes but carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone raised to believe his ancestry ties him to something ancient. People glance at him, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with quiet recognition. They sense he is part of a story bigger than the present moment. And though none of them speaks the word Nephilim, the pattern behind the myth lives on in their understanding of who he is. Chapter 4. The Renaissance of an Ancient Idea, when Old Myths Returned. As the ancient world faded into memory and new civilizations rose from its remnants, the Nephilim myth did not disappear. It simply went quiet, resting in the margins of old manuscripts, drifting through folklore, lingering in symbolic language used to describe powerful families. For centuries, it remained a background idea, neither fully embraced nor fully forgotten. But then something remarkable happened. As humanity entered the medieval and early modern periods, interest in ancient origins surged again. Scholars, monks, explorers, and early historians began piecing together fragments of the past. And in that archaeological, theological, and philosophical curiosity, the Nephilim quietly resurfaced. This resurgence didn't begin with mystics or fringe thinkers. It began with scholars, careful, methodical individuals copying ancient texts in candlelit scriptoria. They encountered brief, tantalizing references to giants of old, mighty men, and renowned ones who lived before floods and upheavals. These lines were so small, so understated, that they invited more questions than answers. Medieval scholars were trained to analyze, compare, and harmonize texts. When they found an unexplained figure, their instinct was not to ignore it, but to understand its place in the larger narrative. And because the Nephilim were mentioned without elaboration, they became a puzzle. Imagine a monk in a stone-walled monastery tracing faded letters on an ancient manuscript. The world outside is quiet, filled with the distant sound of wind across fields. Inside, he pauses as he reads a line referencing beings who lived in an age long before the present order. He doesn't picture towering giants or supernatural hybrids. Instead, he wonders what earlier generations believed. He tries to reconcile the old stories with the theological frameworks of his time. In doing so, he unintentionally keeps the myth alive. As Europe entered the Renaissance, curiosity about the ancient world grew even more intense. Scholars rediscovered classical literature, ancient histories, and forgotten mythologies. They compared stories from different cultures, noting similarities in flood narratives, hero cycles, and references to pre-human or semi-human beings. The Nephilim began appearing in commentaries not as literal beings, but as part of a broader question. What was the early world really like? Why did so many cultures describe ancestral figures who seemed larger than ordinary humans, either physically or symbolically? These weren't supernatural questions, they were historical ones. Renaissance thinkers believed the ancient world held knowledge that had been lost, and they approached the Nephilim myth as part of that lost knowledge. This scholarly curiosity gradually seeped into broader culture. Artists painted scenes depicting ancient beings with exaggerated proportions, not as monsters but as symbols of an age of heroism and struggle. Writers used references to ancient hybrids to evoke mystery and grandeur. The myth gained artistic depth, not as a literal belief, but as a metaphor for humanity's forgotten origins. But something else was happening beneath the surface. As Europe and the Middle East experienced political shifts, people became increasingly interested in tracing noble lineages. Aristocratic families competed for prestige by producing genealogies that stretched back centuries, and in some cases these genealogies reached so far into the past that they touched mythic history. They didn't claim Nephilim ancestry directly, but they claimed descent from ancient kings, culture heroes, or semi-divine figures, the same archetype the Nephilim represented. The symbolic connection between the elites of the ancient world and the elites of the Renaissance became stronger, not because anyone intended it, but because the patterns aligned. This alignment also appeared outside of aristocracies. Travelers exploring distant lands encountered ruins that seemed impossibly old. They wrote journals describing stones too large for modern builders, carvings too precise for current tools, and structures too monumental to align with recorded history. Their accounts echoed the feelings ancient travelers had experienced: awe, humility, and the instinct to believe that earlier civilizations possessed capabilities long since lost. Even if they never used the word Nephilim, the emotional framework was identical. As printed books spread across Europe and the Middle East, ancient myths became accessible to ordinary people for the first time. Stories of giants, fallen beings, and early heroes circulated widely. Most readers treated these stories symbolically, but the symbolic power was enough. When people encountered families who seemed unusually powerful or unusually fortunate, the ancient myths offered a poetic explanation. It wasn't literal, it wasn't accusatory, it was simply a narrative habit older than writing itself, the instinct to trace extraordinary influence back to extraordinary origins. This period also saw the rise of esoteric traditions, groups interested in hidden knowledge, symbolic cosmology, and the idea that the ancient world held secrets beyond the reach of ordinary study. Some of these groups reinterpreted the Nephilim myth through a spiritual lens, arguing that ancient beings represented higher consciousness, fallen wisdom or archetypal forces. They didn't imagine literal giants. They imagined spiritual ancestry, and this idea that some people might carry echoes of ancient insight subtly influenced how later generations interpreted elite families, philosophical schools, and priestly lineages. But even as these interpretations evolved, the myth remained calm, subtle, and symbolic. No one feared ancient beings. No one suspected hidden hybrid bloodlines. Those ideas would come much later. In the medieval and Renaissance mind, the Nephilim were simply reminders of a deeper past, a past that seemed to hold meaning modern life lacked. What gave the myth longevity wasn't a belief in giants, it was a belief in continuity. People sensed that the ancient world had shaped their present in ways they couldn't fully understand. They sensed that forgotten forces lingered beneath the surface of history, and the Nephilim, as symbols of the extraordinary past, represented those forces. As this segment closes, imagine a Renaissance scholar sitting with a stack of manuscripts, each containing fragments of ancient memory. He doesn't seek to prove or disprove the existence of ancient beings. He simply tries to understand how old stories fit into the complex tapestry of humanity's forgotten beginnings. And in that quiet act of curiosity, the myth lives on. As the medieval world gave way to early modern society, something subtle happened in the collective imagination. People began noticing how certain families maintained influence across generations with remarkable consistency. These families weren't always royal. Many belonged to merchant dynasties, religious leadership lines, military households, or noble estates that stretched across continents. And as societies became more literate and more historically aware, people started asking the same question ancient cultures had asked. How do some families seem to persist at the top for so long? This question didn't lead directly to conspiracy. It led to curiosity, quiet, reflective curiosity about the mechanisms of inheritance, both material and psychological. People knew wealth could be passed down, they knew land and titles could be inherited, but they also sensed something more subtle. Temperament, ambition, influence, confidence, and social presence often seemed to run in families. A powerful parent produced powerful children. A diplomatic thinker produced a diplomatic heir. The patterns were hard to miss. And because humans have always looked to the deep past for explanations, old myths resurfaced as symbolic frameworks. The Nephilim myth, in particular, provided a familiar language for thinking about extraordinary lineage, not literally, not as a claim that elites had supernatural ancestry, but as a metaphor, a way of saying that some families carried something ancient, a legacy, a quality, a spark that others did not. Imagine a bustling European port city. Ships arrive from distant coastlines, merchants shout over crates of goods, and among them walks a family whose name appears on buildings, trade guilds, charitable institutions, and civic records. Their influence seems almost woven into the city itself. Residents don't imagine they descend from literal giants, but they may say with a knowing tone, "Old blood runs in their line," echoing a phrase used for thousands of years. That phrase doesn't define biological reality, it defines cultural reality. It's shorthand for generational stability, accumulated wisdom, and the enduring nature of influence. Meanwhile, in palaces and courts across Europe, royal genealogists were crafting lineages that stretched impossibly far into the past. They weren't imagining Nephilim ancestry. They were aligning kings with biblical patriarchs, legendary founders, Trojan heroes, or early culture bearers. But these genealogies shared the same structure that ancient myths had shaped, the idea that power flows down ancient rivers of ancestry. And here's the interesting part. People believed these genealogies not because they were naive, but because they understood their symbolic power. A ruler connected to an ancient mythic founder seemed trustworthy. A noble family linked to early patriarchs seemed legitimate. Myth and legitimacy had been intertwined since the beginning of civilization. That relationship didn't weaken in early modern society, it transformed. At the same time, early scientific thinkers began exploring heredity. Long before genetics existed as a field, observers noticed that traits passed from parent to child. This wasn't seen as mystical, it was simply practical observation. A family of skilled metalworkers produced talented apprentices. A household of leaders produced confident heirs. A dynasty of warriors continued producing formidable commanders. The regularity of inherited traits reinforced the idea that lineage contained something potent and enduring, something that shaped destiny. But the psychological root of this idea was ancient. People still believed, consciously or not, that remarkable lineage had deeper origins. The Nephilim myth lingered in the cultural subconscious because it provided a framework for thinking about lineage as something more than biology, something connected to an older world whose echoes still shaped human affairs. In some regions, this interpretive habit took on a religious tone. Families involved in priestly roles claimed spiritual ancestry stretching back to early prophets or sacred figures. Their authority wasn't based on physical descent from ancient beings, but on spiritual continuity, yet the emotional pattern was the same. Influence flowed from the ancient past into the present through lineage. When political theorists in the Renaissance examined why some states remained stable across centuries, they often pointed to the endurance of certain families. They noted that power wasn't random. It clustered, persisted, and reproduced itself. They didn't attribute this to myth. They attributed it to structure, land ownership, alliances, education, and social status. But beneath these rational explanations lay the older, quieter belief that some families simply carried an ancient kind of influence. This belief extended beyond Europe. In the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, clans traced their lineages back to legendary ancestors whose names blended history and myth. These lineages were often symbolic, emphasizing continuity rather than literal descent. But the effect was the same. Families gained prestige from being connected to a deeper past, and the deeper the past, the more mythic the resonance. Because the Nephilim myth had become a symbol of ancient extraordinariness, it slipped naturally into this cultural current, not directly, not explicitly, but as part of the conceptual background that shaped how people understood lineage, hierarchy, and influence. When someone described a family as having ancient strength or old greatness, they were echoing the emotional core of the Nephilim story, a sense that early human history contained beings or traits that were larger, more capable, or more transcendent than the present. Over time, this symbolic language shaped how societies viewed elite behavior. Children born into powerful families were expected to exhibit certain qualities. If they succeeded, it confirmed the belief that lineage shaped destiny. If they failed, people wondered whether the lineage had weakened. This wasn't superstition, it was psychology. Expectations shape behavior, behavior shapes expectation, and lineage becomes the story people use to connect the two. As this dynamic intensified, the symbolic link between ancient myths and elite families grew stronger. Not because elites claimed supernatural ancestry, they rarely did, but because people instinctively reached for myth when confronted with long-standing influence. Humans understand the present by referencing the past, and the distant past, full of mythic figures and symbolic stories, provides a rich vocabulary for describing extraordinary continuity. By the time early modern thinkers developed theories about human difference, class inheritance, and generational wealth, the symbolic framework for ancient blood was already deeply ingrained. It didn't need to reference giants or fallen beings directly. It simply needed to evoke the idea that some families trace their origins to a time when the world was more enchanted. As this segment ends, imagine a historian in the 1600s reading through stacks of old genealogies. He notes patterns, connections, and the eerie consistency of certain names across centuries. He doesn't accuse anyone of hiding supernatural ancestry, but he does sense something profound. Influence, once established, tends to endure, and myths, especially ancient ones, linger as the symbolic shadows of that endurance. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, the intellectual landscape of the world had shifted dramatically. Scholars were questioning long-held beliefs, analyzing the natural world with new tools, and developing methods that emphasized observation, logic, and empirical study. The scientific revolution was altering how people understood everything from the motion of planets to the composition of matter. Yet in a world becoming increasingly rational, myths like that of the Nephilim did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. They found new ways to exist, not as literal accounts, but as philosophical puzzles, symbolic markers, and cultural echoes that continued to shape how people thought about human origins and exceptional individuals. The Enlightenment did not erase mystery. It refined it. Thinkers of this era were fascinated by origins, the origins of species, civilizations, languages, and societal structures. They studied ancient texts not to affirm traditional beliefs, but to understand humanity's earliest thought patterns. When they encountered references to ancient beings of renown, they didn't interpret them as supernatural giants. They treated them as reflections of how early people explained extraordinary figures. The Nephilim became a case study in myth-making, a window into the psyche of ancient civilizations. Imagine a scholar in a dim study surrounded by manuscripts collected from across Europe and the Middle East. Candlelight flickers across diagrams of ancient alphabets, timelines of human migration, and sketches of megalithic structures. As the scholar reads about ancient mighty men, he doesn't assume literal truth. Instead, he asks, what did people believe when they wrote this? What were they trying to explain? How did they perceive difference, lineage, and power? These questions kept the myth alive, not as a supernatural story, but as an anthropological one. This was also the era when early scientists and philosophers began studying human variation. Without the insights of modern genetics, they relied on observation of physical traits, family patterns, and regional differences. They noticed that certain families consistently produced scholars, generals, artists, or leaders. They attributed this to environment, education, and inheritance. But because ancient stories were still part of cultural consciousness, the idea of ancient traits lingered in the background. No one spoke of Nephilim lineage explicitly. However, the old symbolic framework, that extraordinary ability must come from extraordinary origins, quietly shaped how people interpreted human potential. At the same time, travelers and explorers were returning from distant lands with accounts of ruins, monuments, and cultural practices that seemed astonishingly advanced for their estimated ages. Enlightenment thinkers trained to study rather than mythologize catalogued these wonders carefully, but even as they applied reason, They couldn't fully dispel the emotional impact of the ancient world's grandeur. Some explorers described their experiences in ways that echoed the awe ancient travelers must have felt. They didn't invoke giants, but they did invoke lost knowledge and forgotten ages, terms that resonated with the emotional core of the Nephilim myth. This is when the symbolic link between ancient beings and ancient achievements strengthened again. Rational thinkers acknowledged that early civilizations were capable of extraordinary feats, but they also recognized how little was known about the earliest stages of human history. The lack of information created a space where myth and reason could coexist, not as rivals, but as complementary ways of exploring the unknown. The Enlightenment also brought new attention to genealogy. As record-keeping improved and the idea of scientific classification expanded, genealogical research became more precise. Families traced their ancestry through church records, legal documents, and historical archives, and while most lineages were entirely ordinary, a few revealed extraordinary longevity, influence, or stability. These families became subjects of study. Philosophers speculated about hereditary genius. Biologists theorized about inherited traits long before genetics emerged. And in the collective imagination, the idea of old blood took on a modern secular form, still linked to ancient origins, but now framed through early scientific reasoning. The Nephilim myth didn't vanish in this period. It simply became quieter, more subtle, more symbolic. Enlightenment thinkers weren't interested in supernatural explanations, but they were deeply interested in the psychological and cultural foundations of myth. They treated stories like the Nephilim as evidence of early human attempts to make sense of difference, hierarchy, and ancestry. In doing so, they kept the myth alive as a topic of intellectual curiosity. Meanwhile, artists, poets, and novelists of the Romantic period seized upon the emotional resonance of ancient myths. They loved the idea of forgotten ages filled with extraordinary beings. They weren't claiming literal truth. They were exploring themes of transcendence, destiny, and the sublime. And in their work, the Nephilim functioned as symbols of humanity's lost connection with something vast and mysterious. This artistic revival filtered quietly into everyday cultural imagination. People didn't talk explicitly about Nephilim or ancient hybrids, but they spoke of ancient greatness, forgotten wisdom, and bloodlines touched by the past. These phrases echoed the emotional core of the myth without referencing it directly, and the more they circulated, the more the myth's symbolic power persisted, not as supernatural lore, but as a poetic way of thinking about human potential and human origin. By the 19th century, early archaeologists had begun excavating ruins around the world. Their discoveries reignited public fascination with ancient civilizations, monumental architecture, unusual burial practices, and vast cities hidden beneath sand or jungle revived old questions about the early world's capabilities. The Nephilim myth resurfaced in conversation, not literally, but as a symbolic shorthand for the extraordinary people of the ancient past. Writers described ancient builders as giant-like in wisdom or strength, not because they believed in literal giants, but because the metaphor felt right. Ancient civilizations did appear larger than life, and as scientific progress accelerated, so did a quiet irony. The more people learned about ancient civilizations, the more extraordinary they seemed. Excavations revealed engineering feats that challenged modern assumptions. Discovery of lost cities and forgotten cultures hinted at histories far more complex than previously believed. In this atmosphere, the old myths didn't seem childish or irrelevant. They seemed like early poetic attempts to describe the awe that archaeology would later confirm. By the end of this period, the Nephilim myth had fully transitioned into a modern form. It no longer functioned as literal genealogy, theological symbol, or political tool. It functioned as a cultural echo, a reminder that humanity's origins are deeper, stranger, and more layered than most people realize. It symbolized the ancient sense that greatness has roots, that lineage shapes destiny, and that the past contains mysteries that still hum beneath the surface of the present. As this segment ends, imagine a quiet study filled with early archaeological sketches, handwritten notes, and fragments of ancient pottery. A scholar sits at a desk, comparing myths from different cultures. He isn't seeking proof of giants. He is tracing patterns. Patterns of human imagination, patterns of memory, patterns of the awe our ancestors felt when looking back at the earliest chapters of human history. In those patterns, he sees the lingering shadow of the Nephilim, not as beings, but as symbols of humanity's eternal fascination with origins and lineage. By the time the modern world emerged, with its nation-states, rapid communication, scientific revolutions, and global networks, the original Nephilim myth had traveled a long, winding path. It had shifted from an explanation for extraordinary individuals to a foundation for ancient aristocracies, to a theological symbol of early world instability, to a philosophical question about human origins. But in this new era, something else began to happen. The myth subtly transformed into a metaphor for power itself. Not supernatural power, not monstrous ancestry, but the more familiar humankind, the power that accumulates across generations, concentrates in certain families, and shapes the world quietly from the background. Modern people no longer looked at towering ruins and assumed ancient beings built them. Archaeology explained the techniques, engineering explained the feats, yet the sense of awe didn't vanish. Instead, it migrated. It moved from stone structures to social structures, the towering institutions, dynasties, and families whose influence seemed to stretch impossibly far across history. When people asked how a single lineage could accumulate wealth, connections, and influence across centuries, the ancient myth offered a familiar framework, not literally but symbolically. The Nephilim became shorthand for any lineage that seemed larger than life. Imagine someone in the early 20th century reading about a banking family whose name appears in political, industrial, and philanthropic records across multiple nations. Or a royal house that has survived revolutions, wars, and social upheavals. Or a business dynasty whose decisions ripple through entire markets. People don't assume these families descend from supernatural beings, but they sometimes describe them using mythic language, old blood, ancient stock, a lineage touched by history. These phrases echo thousands of years of human thought. They reflect our instinct to connect power with origins, and because power often feels intangible, mythic language becomes a way of expressing that intangibility. The Nephilim myth, stripped of its literal elements, provides a narrative habit. When something about the present feels larger than the available explanations, we look backward. We frame it as continuity with something ancient. This is not irrational, it is human. We understand ourselves by understanding our stories. Even in modern political commentary, traces of this pattern appear. Analysts describe some leaders as having an aura, gravitas, or presence, qualities ancient people would have attributed to lineage shaped by early world beings, not literally but symbolically. These descriptions suggest a connection between personality and ancestry, even when we know the explanation lies in psychology, environment, and upbringing. The old mythic language still slips through because it describes a feeling, the feeling that some individuals carry a weight of history within them. Meanwhile, anthropology, psychology, and sociology began exploring how families transmit influence across generations. They discovered that inherited networks, education, confidence, and opportunity form a kind of modern lineage. It isn't mysterious, it isn't hidden, but it feels ancient. The patterns of generational power resemble the patterns ancient people attributed to mythic ancestry. And because myths often emerge from emotional patterns rather than literal events, the Nephilim story found its way into modern imagination as a metaphor for the enduring nature of influence. As society globalized, these emotional patterns magnified. People became more aware of families whose power extended across industries and nations. They noticed how some names seemed to reappear in politics, finance, and culture. They wondered whether something more than economic advantage held those families together. But instead of turning to literal myth, they turned to symbolic echo, the idea that some lineages carry ancient momentum. This momentum isn't supernatural, it's structural. But structure, when it persists long enough, begins to feel mythic. This feeling intensified as modern media evolved. Films, novels, and documentaries drew inspiration from ancient stories of fallen angels, hybrid beings, and pre-flood civilizations, not to present them as fact, but to explore themes of forbidden knowledge, ancient power, and hereditary influence. Writers borrowed the emotional shape of the Nephilim myth because it resonates on a deep level. It speaks to the tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the present and the ancient, between human ability and the unknown. When modern stories depict elite families with hidden pasts or ancestral secrets, they often echo the myth's emotional structure without referencing the Nephilim directly. This narrative pattern appears even in everyday conversation. When someone describes a modern leader as being born for power, they echo the ancient idea that lineage shapes destiny. When someone says a famous figure has the look of old blood, they tap into a metaphor that has existed since the earliest storytellers explained the exceptional through ancestry. The language persists because the patterns persist. Of course, modern science does not support the existence of supernatural bloodlines, but science does recognize that environment, social networks, education, opportunity, and psychological reinforcement create generational momentum. A family that acquires influence tends to maintain it. A lineage that enters elite circles tends to remain there. These forces are not mystical, but they create patterns that look and feel like mythic continuity. This is where the Nephilim myth quietly blends with modern interpretation. It becomes a symbolic way of discussing how certain families appear to move through history with unusual stability, not because they carry ancient hybrid genes, but because they inherit the structures, social, economic, cultural, that shape influence. And yet humans rarely describe these patterns in technical terms. We describe them through story. We return to metaphors. We reach for the mythic language that has helped us make sense of difference for thousands of years. This is why the Nephilim myth persists in modern imagination, not as a literal claim but as a conceptual framework. It represents the idea that some power feels older than the world around it. It represents the feeling that history is shaped not just by individuals, but by lineages with deep roots. It represents the notion that origins matter, even when those origins have been softened into symbolism. As this segment closes, imagine standing in a modern city at night, surrounded by skyscrapers, traffic, and glowing screens. Somewhere above you sits an office where decisions are being made that will ripple across nations. You don't imagine Nephilim in that room, but you might feel, quietly, instinctively, that power carries history, that influence moves through time like a river, that some families trace their origins to moments that feel larger than memory, and that ancient myths, softened by centuries, still shape how we interpret the world's most enduring hierarchies. The final chapter will explore how the Nephilim myth, after thousands of years of transformation, became entangled with modern speculation about elite families, not as sensational claims, but as the culmination of humanity's oldest storytelling instinct. As we arrive at the end of this quiet journey through myth, lineage, and the long shadow of ancient stories, take a moment to settle deeper into your pillow, or let your shoulders relax wherever you're sitting. The world you and I live in now is almost unrecognizably different from the one that first produced the Nephilim myth. Cities rise in steel and glass, information travels instantly across continents, and the mysteries that once filled the night sky have been reduced to equations and star maps. Yet even in this modern landscape, some stories linger. Some ideas drift gently beneath the surface of thought, resurfacing not because we believe them literally, but because they touch on something universal. Our curiosity about where we came from and why some people, families, and civilizations appear to carry a momentum that stretches across centuries. The story of the Nephilim is one of those ideas. It has traveled an extraordinary distance. It began as a brief and ambiguous line in an ancient text, a small spark of curiosity about how early humans explained extraordinary individuals. Then it grew into symbolic lineage claims for ruling families. It became a theological metaphor in religious traditions. Later, it evolved into a cultural echo used to explain mysterious ruins or traits that seem to run in certain lineages. Modern thinkers transformed it again, seeing it as a window into ancient psychology rather than ancient biology. And today the myth sits quietly at the intersection of history, imagination, and instinct, a reminder that human beings have always looked toward the past to understand the present. If you think back to the 4 chapters of this exploration, a pattern emerges. In chapter 1, we saw how the earliest people approached difference, physical difference, spiritual difference, intellectual difference, with stories rather than measurements. For them, myth was a tool, not a flight of fantasy. It helped them organize the world. It helped them explain why some individuals seemed extraordinary. And in those early days, when the boundary between the human and the divine felt thin, the idea of beings like the Nephilim was simply part of the landscape, neither frightening nor controversial. In chapter 2, we traced how that myth gradually became absorbed into lineage, prestige, and social structure. Families who wished to anchor their identity in the distant past reached for mythic figures and early ancestors. They didn't claim supernatural traits, they claimed continuity, a way of saying that their authority had roots deeper than the memories of other families. The Nephilim myth wasn't the source of this behavior. It was one example of a much older instinct to weave ancestry and identity together. By chapter 3, we saw how ruins, forgotten cultures, and the slow fading of historical memory allowed the myth to evolve again. When people stood before monumental structures or encountered traditions they could no longer fully explain, they turned to metaphors. They spoke of giants of old, not because they believed in literal giants, but because they needed language large enough to describe the awe they felt. And as archaeology slowly revealed the complexity of ancient civilizations, the myth didn't evaporate. It softened, becoming a symbol for the extraordinary capabilities of early humanity. Finally, in Chapter 4, we explored how the myth reached the modern world, not through literal belief, but through cultural echo, through metaphor, through the quiet observation that influence and power often travel along family lines. People noticed that some families persisted across centuries of upheaval. They didn't assume anything mystical. They simply used old stories to give shape to a feeling, the feeling that power carries history with it, moving from generation to generation like a river flowing through landscapes of time. Now, at the end of our journey, the Nephilim myth sits not as a literal account, but as a reminder of something deeper. It reminds us that humans have always been storytellers, that we use narrative to explain what we see and what we don't. That myth is not an alternative to history, but an early attempt to describe patterns that later become the subject of scholarship. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that some questions about lineage, influence, and origins don't need final answers to be meaningful. The myth endures because it comforts us. It gives us a poetic way to talk about ancestry and power without reducing those concepts to charts or statistics. It helps us imagine continuity across vast stretches of time, and in a world that moves faster than ever, there is something soothing about that continuity, something restful even. It tells us that we are connected to a much older story, and that the ancient past still hums quietly beneath the surface of our modern lives. So as we close this exploration, let your mind drift gently over the landscape of history, from early villages lit by firelight to ancient empires carved from stone, to medieval scholars pondering old manuscripts, to modern cities glowing under towering skyscrapers. In each era, humans have looked backward to understand their place in the world. The Nephilim myth is one thread in that long tapestry, weaving together our fascination with origins, ancestors, power, and the mystery of what came before memory. If your eyes feel heavy now, that's good. Let them close slowly. Let the stories of ancient lineages and forgotten ages soften into a quiet haze. Whether you're listening to this in bed, on a couch, or somewhere peaceful, you're now part of the long human tradition of ending the day with stories that offer both wonder and calm. Stories that don't demand belief, but invite reflection. Stories that lull the mind toward rest. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most persistent and gently mysterious ideas. And if you'd like to explore more forgotten civilizations, more ancient puzzles, and more quietly fascinating chapters of human history, remember to subscribe so you never miss another voyage designed to ease your mind into sleep. For now, take a slow breath. Let the past recede into a comfortable distance, and let the quiet settle around you like a soft blanket, a reminder that history is wide, time is deep, and you have permission to drift into rest.